Hello and welcome to the Sunday Guardian podcast by Joyeeta Basu. Viewers, I have a very interesting guest with me today. Someone who is full of anecdotes. If you start talking to her, you are going to have the time of your life. I had a dinner meeting with her recently. She is in India. She is an American. And the kind of anecdotes she told me and a couple of other friends, she had us in splits for about 3.5 hours. But of course, I'm sorry to say we cannot repeat all those anecdotes in public. But even then, she will be able to say a lot of things, and I'm certain all of you will be enjoying that. Welcome to the show, Maura Moynihan. And Maura is an author, Tibetologist. She's an expert on Chinese communist occupation of Tibet, and she is an Indologist. She loves India. She is also the daughter of US Ambassador to India in the early 70s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was ambassador and then later senator from New York for decades. So Maura has had a ringside view of American politics all through her life. Having said that, let's see how much we can talk about today. Welcome, Maura, once again to the show.
Dhanyavad Joyeeta ji.
Yeah, and she does speak Hindi when she wants. She can manage a smatter of Hindi.
Zarur, kyun nahi?
Oh, that's
Hindi
nice.
bahasha bahut pasand. No, I love it. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, Joyeeta. I really admire your work on NewsX.
And Sunday Guardian.
And Sunday Guardian, both because I watch NewsX in America. I think it's far superior to a lot of the news that used to be good in America. And yes, I do love India. I first came to India 52 years ago. When my father was named the American ambassador to the United States, I came.
That was 1973.
1973.
So tell me about your love affair with India.
Well, it started the moment the plane door opened, and I inhaled the Khushboo of Bharat Mata.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yes, and that primordial mix of incense and flowers and smoke, and I just felt it seemed so familiar. And then, of course, the international flights, that was the time of Pan Am 1, Pan Am 2, that's since gone. They used to circle the globe every 24 hours, one going east, one going west. We were met by a delegation from the Indian government, and we drove from what was then Palam Airport, there was no Indira Gandhi International Airport, down Shanti Path to the American Embassy residence. And I saw some very simple scenes of Indian life, like a man in a dhoti on a bicycle, and of course the cows walking in. Everything just looked and felt completely familiar. And I felt so at home. And I was only 15. And greeting us when we arrived at Roosevelt House, the residence, was our neighbor, literally lived down the street from us in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where my father, who had been a professor at Harvard before becoming ambassador to India, there was standing our neighbor, Kitty Galbraith,
Okay.
the wife of John Kenneth Galbraith, who had been President Kennedy's ambassador to India and who also adored India. And to see her there and to see the daughter of the deputy chief of mission, Galen Stone, his beautiful daughter, dressed in a sari, speaking fluent Hindi. And she put tika on all of us, and Kitty put the malas on all of us. And Kitty took my hand and said, "Welcome home." And so hence the love affair began, and my feelings about India have never changed.
That's so nice. And viewers, she has got so many tales to. And one of her favorite heroes, or rather her favorite hero, is Shahrukh Khan, isn't it?
Haan ji, zarur. Absolutely. I love Shahrukh Khan. I have loved him since I first saw Dil Se. I was working in Kathmandu, and the train scene, Jaya Jaya. It's unforgettable. But I also think that Shahrukh is obviously very intelligent. I've never met him, always wanted to. He's a Delhi wala, like me. And I love his life story. And I love his patriotism and his love for India. And I love it that he and Salman Khan frequently rate in international polling as the most famous people in the world, because of Bollywood's tremendous popularity. Because Bollywood is making better films than Hollywood these days for lots of reasons, but maybe that's another podcast.
Yeah, definitely. That's another podcast. And you see, your dad's, when you are talking about your love for India, your dad's love for India is also well known. At least in people who remember those times, they talk about it. Now, share some of your memories about your dad as US ambassador to India.
Oh gosh, there's so many. In fact,
And you told me some very interesting story about USAID also. I'm certain so much in the news. Your dad and USAID's interaction. I'm certain viewers would love to hear that.
well, let's start with that because that was one of the first things that Dad had to deal with when he arrived as ambassador. There had not been an ambassador in New Delhi for almost 3 years because of the America's tilt to Pakistan and the Bangladesh War of Independence and the PL 480 funds. We're going to get to that next. But first, Indira Gandhi's government expelled in 1973 the Peace Corps, the Rockefeller Foundation, and USAID. USAID was allowed to keep a skeletal staff, but it had built a massive, for the time, in Delhi, a very tall building that later became the Akbar Hotel. I don't know if it's been torn down or if it's still there. Dad felt, well, this is the Indian government's decision. It's the sovereign nation, and we should absolutely give this building back to the Indian government. And there was a certain gentleman on the Asia desk of the Department of State in Washington who was very anti-India. There's always been that strain, that anti-India strain from the Cold War. We can discuss that later. And he found out that Dad had given the USAID building back to the Indian government according to the agreement. He was furious, and he sent off a vicious cable, which I have a copy of. You know, in those days, there was no internet. It took a week to book a call from India to America. You know, there was no mobile phone, so diplomatic cables were very important. And the cable said, "How dare you give the Indian government that building? You get it back."
It was from the State Department gentleman.
Yeah, USAID, State Department, whatever. I mean, technically they're two different agencies, but he was, you know, they're all clubby. They all go to the same golf clubs and dining facilities in Washington. It's called the Inside the Beltway. Dad wrote back a famous cable that he made an open cable so it could be read everywhere, saying, "Got your cable too late. Handed over the keys yesterday. Seems you USAID men have an edifice complex."
That's absolutely brilliant.
It's so funny.
Share a couple of other stories as well, please.
Well, the other issue that Dad faced was, well, the USAID thing. And again, he felt, you know, I feel the same way, Joyeeta. I'm a guest in India. It's not my place to lecture India about what it does and doesn't do with its government, with its choices. And Dad felt the same way. You know, he said, he wrote famously also to the State Department and later in one of his books, people have to remember that half of the human beings on planet Earth with civil rights exist in India, because India is the world's largest democracy. And so he felt it was very, very important that India and American relations be strengthened. Why isn't the world's richest democracy, the United States, more aligned with the world's largest democracy, India? And that's another thing I've always loved about India. There's always elections going on all the time. There's so many newspapers. There's just so many cultural events. But, you know, the population's very engaged. You know, voter participation in America is like 30%. What is it in India? It's almost 70%. I mean, people vote all the time, and there's like by-elections here and there everywhere. So, and Dad really admired that too. He admired India's democracy, and he admired, and we got to know many members of the Gandhian, the Quit India movement, the Indian freedom movement. President Giri, in fact, Dad presented his credentials.
V.V. Giri.
Yes, who was part of the team of the Gandhian freedom fighters and so forth. And so we always had them over to dinner. You know, we gave great parties. My mother and father thought Roosevelt House was very dreary and dull. The architect also did the Kennedy Center in Washington, exactly the same. And Dad was fond of quoting Disraelis about Roosevelt House saying that made by a man who had but one idea and it was wrong. So that Mom decided, how are we going to spice it up? So she brought American artists over, she brought Indian artists over, opened up the house.
Your mom was also a great lover of India, isn't it?
Oh my God, yes. She found the first Mughal site in India, Babur's Victory Garden that he built, I believe, 1513. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Lotus Garden in Dholpur in 1978.
For the viewers, her mother passed away recently,
Yes.
isn't it?
Age 94, and so I hadn't been to India for 5 years. I was nursing Mom, but I came back to spread her ashes here, which I did, in the country she loved so very much. But let's go back to Dad and the rupee deal, because the rupee deal is very, very important. I think a lot of younger Indians don't know this piece of history. There, in the 1960s, the American government had sold grain, wheat, to India with very, very, very high interest, which meant, as Dad said in memo after memo and cable after cable, it essentially meant that the U.S. government had control over India's finances. And he said, this is not a good way to have a respectful partnership between the two democracies, and we've got to fix the debt on the PL 480 funds. Anyone watching, you can do your own research on this. It's out there. There have been books written about it. But to make long story short, so Dad figured out a solution. Said 1/3 of the funds of the debt that India owed the United States will be forgiven. 1/3 will be used to fund U.S. consular diplomatic activities into perpetuity. And the third, and the most important in my view, was he created the Indo-U.S. Subcommission on Art, Culture, and Science. It was an extremely successful cultural and scientific exchange program that sent thousands of young Indians and Americans to each other's country. In fact, there was a study that showed sort of the Silicon Valley, the tech revolution, more than half of the brain trust was from Indian students who'd come to America on the Indo-US Subcommission grants. And over the years, I've met Americans who said, that I got a grant that changed my life. I went to India, I studied Bharat dance, I studied Urdu ghazals, I studied Gandhian law. I met one lady who studied in Tibetan Tanka painting. Now, this was stopped by President Bill Clinton in the 1990s. He never gave an answer as to why. My mother was absolutely furious because she was a part of the Indo-US Subcommission. She would come to India every year. She was very active with the choice of programs, and it really did bring India and America close together. You know what Indian diplomats like to say, people-to-people connections. Indians and Americans have always loved Indian culture. I mean, they've always loved Indian food, and when they go to India, it's people just on holiday, they just fall in love with it, always have. But this strengthened it, because there's a difference between coming to India on a 3-week tour and staying for a year, and really delving deeply into a topic, whether it is Kathak dance, whether it is a study of Tamil literature or something.
Which that particular program enabled, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And what made Dad very excited and happy, because he liked making history, shall we say, and he did many times in his career. But he was in the Guinness Book of World Records for signing the world's largest check to Indira Gandhi to settle the rupee deal, and he had that framed. And in fact, I also have I have the whole box of all of this, and I'm going to write a book, Joyeeta. The pressure from Indian friends has convinced me now is the time. to write a book called Moynihan in India, and it will tell the story of my mother and my father and go deeper into this. But Mom tried very hard to get the Indo-US Subcommission revived. The Indians wanted it very badly. It was very, very popular with the Indian government and Indian cultural institutions. And we've seen a drop off in interest in funding for Indian language, culture, and so forth in American universities when Bill Clinton just pulled the plug on the subcommission, and there was no need to do it. The funds were there.
That's really sad. And
Yeah, it is.
now you just talked about a very strong anti-India streak that has existed in a section of the US administration. Why do you think so?
That's a very good question. It's a question a lot of us who love India and are very pro-India have
Because you see,
wondered.
also, this brings me also to what we were just discussing before this show, that very strong anti-India streak in the US media, mainstream media. Is everything related? What is exactly going on in this case?
Well, with the expose of what USAID has really been up to all these years and how it's been funding media organizations and how it's been abusing our tax dollars so egregiously, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a group of people who have been either captured or willingly coordinating with Communist China to weaken Indo-US ties and to present these negative stories about India. But in the media in particular, it's shocking. I've been going through all Mom and Dad's files since my mother passed away, and fortunately, Dad's Senate career happened just before the internet revolution. So you have all these old boxes of the New York Times, of Washington Post, of Time Magazine, Newsweek, and the writing was so much better, the research was so much better, the point of view was fair in most cases. Now that's totally gone out the window. Well, because with the rise of the internet, revenue dropped tremendously for media companies, so they started taking advertising dollars from the Chinese Communist Party in the form of China daily inserts, which appear, I would always find it shocking. You know, my mother always had a habit of reading the New York Times. Would come to our doorstep in Manhattan, and every week an enormous, thick China daily insert would fall out. And that's just pure propaganda from Xinhua, which was started in 1933, I believe, as Red China News Agency. And Xinhua is the basis of the Global Times, China Daily. Every single city in America is peppered with China daily news boxes to normalize communist China, and thereby normalize the
Even now?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, and people ask me, like, oh, I went and I got it, and isn't it, I mean, and it's propaganda, and especially when it comes to Tibet and it comes to the Uyghurs, and that's why you won't see a mention of the Uyghur genocide. Once in a while, there may be a teeny little story about the ongoing slaughter of the Uyghur Muslims in what is Western Communist China. East Turkestan is how I prefer to call it, because they're a Turkic people. There's demolition of their mosques and so forth. You never hear a peep about that. But there's always stories about how India is the rape capital of the world, and how this is what I get all the time, Joyeeta, and I find it very, very annoying. But it shows the success of propaganda, because unfortunately, propaganda works. That's something the 20th century certainly has taught us, and 21st so far. People always at cocktail parties in New York and Washington and Boston say, oh, but India, how can you like India? The treatment of women is so appalling. And I have to say, really? Because, India's had a female prime minister in the 1970s, Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And yes, of course, there are cases where women are mistreated, but isn't that true in all societies? And in Indian society, I think women fare far, far better than they do in a lot of places in Asia, in what is called the third world, or the non-Western world. And look how many Indian women are in government. Look at you. Look at your accomplishments. And good God, look at Bollywood. And look at all the Indian women when they started entering beauty contests, just started winning everything, Miss Universe, Miss World. And I remember, so wonderful. I was in Delhi and opened up the papers. The headline of it was, India has become a beauty superpower. No one's disputing that. But I mean, that's a narrative that has been promoted again and again and again and again. You see it in The Economist. And they don't talk about the fact that the Taliban has now banned women from getting an education. And I believe last week a poor woman had her hand cut off in Kabul because she was caught writing. You never hear any stories about that. You never hear about the poor suffering of the people of Afghanistan, whom India helped a great deal, of course. How many Afghan refugees has India given shelter and sanctuary to since beginning with the Soviet occupation and the Taliban? And Hamid Karzai lived in India for many years. India invested a lot in Afghanistan. I went to Afghanistan with my mother in 1978 before the Soviet occupation. We went to Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan. She was doing research on the Mughals, and I got to see the former Soviet Union, which was fascinating. And you get to democratic India, and you just feel the freedom. Of course, it's not perfect, but neither is human nature.
Exactly. Which country is perfect?
Exactly, there isn't one.
No, talking about China, and as I mentioned in your introduction, that you are an expert on Chinese communist occupation of Tibet. I mean, I remember you telling me the story about how you were protesting in front of the, I think, Chinese embassy?
Yes.
In Washington?
Yes.
And it was such a scandal because a senator's daughter got arrested or something?
Yes.
So you're famous that way, isn't it? And
Oh,
China
yes.
doesn't like you.
No, they don't. Well, I'll tell that story because it's I've another story that made me so proud of my Indian friends. Bill Clinton, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, which was broadcast on American TV everywhere, I think the Communist China also realized we better infiltrate the media more, because that's why you never see anything about the Uyghur genocide, which is ongoing as we sit in this lovely studio in New Delhi. Men, women, and children are being slaughtered in concentration camps, Chinese concentration camps that would make a Nazi proud. Never hear about that. But everybody saw the Tiananmen Square massacre. So the Senate and the House of Representatives in America, my father was very much a part of this effort, put sanctions on Communist China, that trade deals couldn't go forward with America without an annual human rights review. Well, Bill Clinton tore that up in 1994, just in his first term, with an executive order, and gave China most favored nation trading status. And so and this does not benefit the Chinese people either. And I've constantly argued my whole life with Americans who say, oh, well, the Chinese Communist Party has, raised the standard of living. I said, at a great cost. Don't you think the Chinese people are capable of succeeding without the boot of the Communist Party on their neck? Well, that's another subject, but back to my arrest scenario. So I was so enraged that Bill Clinton did this because, again, it was of no benefit to the people of China. It was a slap in the face to the brave students of Tiananmen. It was also not good for stability in Asia. It was basically strengthening the Chinese Communist Party, letting them off the hook for also Mao's horrific genocide, the Great Leap Forward, called the 3 lean years in Tibet. We were 80 million people, it is estimated, starved to death, and the Cultural Revolution. So it was basically whitewashing all of that. So I said, I had friends who spent many years going every week to you could apply for a permit in those days in Washington, I don't know if you still can, to do civil disobedience, Gandhian style, in front of a foreign embassy. And you would be arrested, held in jail for 5 hours, and charged $50 for incommoding. Nothing on your record, no criminal record. But I wanted to know how it felt to get arrested, because I felt you couldn't do human rights research and reporting that I did for so many years for the Tibetans without knowing what it felt like to be handcuffed, put in a cell. And I also wanted to embarrass Bill Clinton. I was furious at him for doing this and for ending the Indo-US.
Your father was Democratic senator, of course.
Yeah, but he also called out Bill Clinton for all these things, and one of the only ones.
So what happened exactly on that?
So
day?
I asked people to join me and nobody would. So I went home to my little house and I sat in front of a picture of Mahatma Gandhi and I just closed my eyes and said, okay, I'll do it alone. No sooner had I thought that than the phone rang and an older lady, Indian friend of mine, Amita, said, Maura, I'm going to join you. It's not fair. I'll do it with you. And once she did that, a couple other people, so just 5 of us, we went, we applied for a permit. The police came and said, are you Maura Moynihan? I said, yes, this is my protest. I hope you will arrest us. I said, sure, we'll tell you what to do. Just line up right there and don't get up. On the third time, we're going to handcuff you and take you away. So we sat there and we'd sent out a press release. And just at the end of the third time, ABC, CBS, NBC news trucks came. So I said to the arresting officer, officer, the nightly news trucks have just come. Can you drag it out a little bit so we can make the nightly news? He said, sure. I'm going to have to arrest you for incommoding the Chinese embassy on behalf of the Tibetan people. And so locked up, it was on the, it was in all the news and took us, and it was a very, and the officers were great. We said, we support your cause, because friends of mine had done this for years to free Nelson Mandela. Some of my friends went once a week, and he was freed eventually. The Tibetan people are not free, the Chinese people are not free. But I felt it was very important to make that statement, Joyeeta.
So you have been very pro-Tibetan, of course. You've been to China as well.
Yes.
How did you handle that, and what did you see over there?
I'm one of the only people you'll ever meet who went to communist China during the Cultural Revolution. And what started me on my journey...
This was...
1975.
Okay.
My Tibet journey, if you can call it that, began after I arrived in India. I was the new kid at the American school in Delhi, and I was invited on the winter class trip to Kulu Manali. So I joined, and I'd only been in India 3 weeks. And it took 2 days then to drive to Kulu, and I saw all these Tibetan refugees working as on the road gangs. I thought, what is going on here? And my Indian host explained, well, about the Chinese occupation of Tibet, the flight of the Dalai Lama. These were things I didn't know. And then we went up to an old pass near Kulu that for centuries had been part of the salt trade between India and Tibet. And I saw Chinese soldiers on one side, Indian soldiers on the other. I thought, oh my God, this is a very serious situation. This is a great, tremendous risk to India's security, because Tibet is the high ground of Asia. It's the source of the 9 great rivers of Asia. It is the high plateau. And then there were Tibetans in my school. There was, and of course, in those days, there were a lot of Tibetan stalls on Janpath that the Indian government had provided. The Indian people and the Indian government, in my view, deserve a gold medal for their humanitarian service and care for the Tibetan refugees, particularly the Dalai Lama, who's turning 90 in July. And it just enrages communist China that he escaped, that India gives him refuge and protection and security. And there's some people in the Tibet movement in America, which has shrunk down to almost nothing now for various reasons.
Why is it like that?
Well, it really started with Obama when he refused to meet His Holiness Dalai Lama in 2009 after Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize. And his first statement was, I will not meet my fellow Nobel laureate, the Dalai Lama, because I want to work with China. And I was in Dharamshala with His Holiness at that time. I was still working for Radio Free Asia's Tibet service. And the Tibetans there felt very disappointed. The Indian government was very upset about it as well, because India takes a tremendous, caring for the Tibetan refugees, protecting them.
We take pride in the fact that the Dalai Lama is here.
And you protect him.
Yes.
And you have to spend an enormous amount of money in a military budget defending the border.
Yes, and in spite of that, we have allowed the Tibetans, to continue with their movement. I think that's a fantastic thing that could have happened. And if given the fact, the kind of animosity, okay, the Chinese are trying to, making very placatory noises, but that hardly counts. And so tell me, what did you see in China?
Oh, that was my first trip. Then I went later in the 90s to Tibet a few times, only on a tourist visa. You can't go as a journalist, and I didn't want to. And then I also managed to sneak in for 24 hours in 2017 to Shanghai. Boy, had it changed from what I saw in 1975. I was actually quite shocked by what I saw in communist China during the Cultural Revolution compared to democratic India. And I had also, by that time, I had traveled to Bangladesh, I had been to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, to Thailand with my parents. So I'd seen a lot of Asia by then. Hong Kong before it, when it was still a British colony, it was just such a fantastic city, the best food, the most beautiful and free. Nobody talks about the plight of the Hong Kong Democrats anymore. That's disappeared from the news as well in the West. No one talks about Jimmy Lai and being in jail for counter-revolutionary thought. So we were in Hong Kong, and then we took a train to Canton, it's now Guangdong, and then we flew to Peking, as it was called then, now been renamed Beijing. And I was absolutely shocked by the difference in the societies. I thought if you'd been a betting man, you'd say the big power in Asia in the future is definitely India. It's not going to be China. People were so poor. I felt heartbroken for the Chinese people. They didn't have the things that you had in India. There were no places of worship. There were no restaurants. There was no commerce. There were no stores. We were there in January, and it was freezing cold in Beijing. And people were lined up, shivering around the block for like one little bag of rice from the People's Commune. And there was fear in people's faces. You could see it. It was palpable. There was terror. Everyone was wearing Mao coats, but it was a color-coded society, as my younger brother noted. And every night, we were guests of then liaison officer George H.W. Bush. We didn't have full diplomatic relations with China. So he asked my father to come because Dad had status of ambassador. So then he could get meetings with top Chinese Communist Party officials, which he couldn't get because you had to have someone with rank of ambassador. And so, I thought, I liked Mrs. Bush very much. I spent a lot of time with her. And, off the record, she could say how,
Barbara Bush, you're talking about.
Yeah, how better people lived in Tokyo and in Hong Kong and in Thailand. But you couldn't say it. She was a very intelligent woman. And
So basically what the transition of China, I would say is that it has become prosperous, richer, but the fear is very much there.
Well, since COVID, there's been a lot of changes. And one indication that the Chinese Communist Party is the bloom's off the rose about that Coca-Cola and communism can coexist, or what we all heard in the 80s when China starts opening up, that Coca-Cola will bring democracy. No, that's not true.
Didn't happen.
No, it didn't happen at all. You've got Victoria's Secret, Nike, Coca-Cola, and you've got a one-party totalitarian dictatorship with some old men behind a curtain, circling around each other, the white hands and the black hands faction of the Chinese Communist Party, which I've studied in detail. Whereas in India, everything's out in the open. Yeah. Good God. But no, but back to your question.
Being abusive about each other also, the political parties. That's also out in the open.
Yes. In high school, we were taken to see the Lok Sabha. This is in the early 70s, and there was a lot of shouting, and someone threw a chappal, and but I thought, hey, it's democracy. But then when I went back to China in 2017, I did see. I was just in Shanghai. I managed to figure out to get a visitor's visa without doing a background check, so they didn't know it was me, Maura Moynihan, of the Tibetan freedom movement. So I was happy to see that the people looked healthier, that they had more food, that there seemed to be more freedom, but there's still no political freedom, and you step out of line, you find yourself in a black site so fast.
Now tell me, we hear about the elite capture of the West by the Chinese. What exactly is going on over there?
What's been going on, Joyeeta, for a very long time. I've lived through it. Now it's been, most of my life, because when I saw the difference between democratic India and communist China in 1975, I then that fall became a freshman at Harvard. And America had just withdrawn from the Vietnam War in disgrace and failure, and left Thailand to fend alone. And with the great late King Rama IX of Thailand, who was my lifelong hero, because he fought a 30-year war with the Communist Party of Thailand and won. They're the only people you can say that about. And because the Vietnam War was so unpopular and the draft was so unpopular and it was not a wise decision. I learned more about it when I lived in Thailand 8 years ago when King Rama IX passed. I reported about his year of mourning. And there are some theories that Communist China kind of lured America into that war to discredit them. And Dad said if only we'd known that the Great Leap Forward was going on and people were starving to death by the millions inside China. But we didn't. There was no news coming out of Communist China. But we were told that we had to fight the Vietnam War to stop communism. Well, today, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia are all communist governments. I feel terribly sorry for the people. And Burma is sort of a proxy state. The freest country is Thailand, Thailand, which was never colonized either. But back to your original question about infiltration. So in 1975, I noticed there was a tremendous anti-American sentiment on all Ivy League campuses because the Vietnam War was so unpopular. And America had failed. People were wearing Mao jackets, holding up the little red book. I doubt they'd ever read it. It's so turgid and so, dreadful. And I would say,
like it is happening with the anti-Semitic protests and Palestinian right now on American campuses, similar to that.
absolutely. I'm very proud of you for the work that you did in your trip to Israel. I thought it was wonderful. No, it's been shocking. I've never seen anything like it, the anti-Semitic protests.
So at that time it was pro-China, anti-American protests.
Well, they weren't burning buildings. I did watch a lot of violent protests in the late 60s when my father was a professor at Harvard and there was a draft. But in 75, the war was over, there was no draft, but it was cool to be a communist. It was cool. And of course, before the Sino-Soviet split, there was a lot of infiltration from the Soviet Union and Communist China into American institutions. So really, the normalization of the Chinese Communist Party really got going with Bill Clinton went after Tiananmen, because everybody saw the images of Tiananmen Square. Even though it was kind of cool to be a Maoist, I truly doubt any of those rich American kids at Harvard with a Mao cap and waving the little red book actually really believed it, or would last 5 minutes in Chinese-occupied Tibet. But that's sort of when, the communism was always present in 20th century academia with the Straussian school. And then from the 1930s with the Great Depression, there was the idea that capitalism had failed so terribly that only socialism was the answer. And then after World War II, that sort of died down, but then it came back again. But the normalization of China really got going in the 80s with Deng Xiaoping and the opening of China. And everywhere you went, all the Harvard guys that were waving Mao caps and stuff when I was a freshman, and I took a gap year and came back to India, so I graduated in 1980. Well, they all went to Harvard Business School, and they wanted to move all their factories to China because China had plenty of slave labor, so you could make a lot of money on the backs of the Chinese people. And this also completely destroyed the American middle class and the American working class. The shipping of the manufacturing jobs.
So it started at that time?
It really started in the 80s.
Okay.
And I was the lone voice. I remember having a teacher's aide, professor's aide. I wrote a paper when I was an 18-year-old freshman saying Tibet was an occupied country and China was a totalitarian dictatorship, communist China. And this was not beneficial to the people, the subject peoples of the Chinese Communist Party. I was flunked. And I was furious. So I went to office hours. And I said, "Why did you flunk me?" And this blonde, blue-eyed Marxist teaching aide said, "Oh, Chairman Mao is like Jesus Christ. He's done so many wonders, and life is much, much better in Tibet." And he gave me a now famous propaganda book called Tibet Today. And you could tell it was propaganda. It looked like, the Stalin put out this kind of propaganda during the 30s, smiling freed serfs on tractors in Tibet. And it was just so obviously propaganda. And I said to him, have you ever been to communist China? He said very defensively, no. I said, well, I have. I was just there. I saw it for myself. And I've just finished high school in India, so why don't you go to communist China and tell me if you think it's better? He got so angry with me, Joyeeta. Oh my God, He said,
And American academia has continued that streak of pro-China, support for China throughout. Till date, I would say.
oh, sure. Chinese, a Harvard professor about 15 years ago, a humanities professor who has since retired, wrote an essay. I clipped it and put it in my files. I forget where it was published, but he said, why are we pushing aside American students and giving prominence to the sons and daughters of Chinese Communist Party members at our finest universities? Why are we putting them before American students, and certainly before Indian students? It's so much easier to get into Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia if your dad is a general in the People's Liberation Army of China than if you're from an elite Indian family. And I can't tell you how many times my mother and I have had friends who, from very prominent Indian families, whose son or daughter got into a top school and the student visa was rejected. And we would write to the State Department and say, please, and we were successful in that. Because, Indians also have an advantage, by the way, because they speak English so beautifully. But the the pro-China thing also was money, taking so many grants. Like China hasn't just poured money into these universities, and they've suddenly, Yale has this enormous medical facility that's named, I forget, from some Chinese donor.
So it is only recently that America has woken up to the fact that China may not exactly be what it claims itself to be.
Well, yes, because we've just, there are a lot of articles this week in America, and what those call alternative media is now more people are reading than legacy media, because legacy media is not what it once was. They're not honest news brokers. And it was 5 years ago when the COVID lockdowns began, and we were lied to about the whole thing. And India handled it so much better. I knew that because I get my news from India. I watch NewsX all the time, and I read all the Indian papers online. And the perception that China is now a threat to America has gone up 88% since the COVID lockdowns.
Even among the people.
Among American citizens,
American
yes.
citizens.
Yes.
Who are being told that China is a great friend.
Yes, the normalization of communist China was a project of the American establishment that had been very successful up till the COVID lockdowns. And here is another tell, if you will, about how China's going to have a hard time persuading people that, yes, communism and Coca-Cola can coexist. Communism is, they all say it, the Chinese people are too weak for democracy. They need a strong, firm hand. Well, that's very insulting to the Chinese people. Look at the brave Hong Kong Democrats and look at the brave people of Taiwan. They've done fine. They've done better with a democratic system like India. And all my Chinese friends who live in exile said that they have a burning hatred for the Chinese Communist Party. But the normalization of China, it's going to be a little harder to get back there because flights to China are down 90%. This is hard data. All the big airlines used to have daily flights to Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangdong. Well, not anymore. They've canceled all of these routes because of lack of demand. And now you see, in the business websites and the U.S.-China Business Council. I used to sign up for their newsletter because you can see what the appeasers are saying. They have absolutely no problem with the slaughter and torture of children in Chinese communist concentration camps. The greatest human rights atrocity on planet Earth. And then I hear some Americans say, oh, well, India has concentration camps. I said, oh, really? Where?
Where exactly?
Yeah, please show me. Here's a map of India. Find a concentration camp for me. Find a mass genocide. They can't. but somehow they've been, believe it, but the Indochina Business Council is pleading and begging with people to take jobs in Shanghai or Beijing. We will even provide concierge services for you, fold your laundry, free gym, but nobody wants to go. And it's actually dangerous. The State Department did put out a warning, I believe 2 years ago, for American citizens to be careful traveling in China. And again, what about the Chinese people? What about their suffering?
Now, which brings us to Mr. Trump and Mr. Trump's approach towards China, and of course, how do you see India-US relations evolving during the time of President Trump?
Well,
First, President Trump and China.
First and foremost, I think it is wonderful.
Here, I find it very interesting. Being the daughter of a Democratic senator, you are now a huge Trump supporter.
Well, of course, like he won in a landslide, you know, and I've met Mr. Trump many times in the 80s and 90s when he first appeared.
You also know Mr. Kash Patel, isn't it?
Yes, I do. I'm very proud of him because Donald Trump is a Democrat. I first met him at a very small dinner party hosted by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, to whom he was very close. And he was a supporter of my father's and my father's campaigns, and he was, you know, every Democrat.
New York. He was from New York. Huh?
Yeah, like my dad. And by the way, every single Democrat politician in New York City pleaded and begged for Donald Trump's endorsement, pleaded for his campaign contributions. He was on every red carpet. He was on the cover of every single magazine. And they just turned on him when he won in 2016 in a way I found was rather frightening because it meant they were not honest newsbrokers. They all knew who he was. They all knew him. Everyone in New York knew who he was. He does have a big personality.
So how did you find Mr. Trump?
I found him very dignified, very, very intelligent. No one can say that he isn't. I found him very polite, charming, tough. But you've got to be tough to be a real estate billionaire in New York City. They're all very, I mean, when people, the media also had brainwash. I really will use that word. New Yorkers who all knew who he was, that, oh, he's stupid, he's lazy. Are you kidding me? Those New York City real estate developers are some of the toughest, most disciplined, most competitive people you will ever meet. They are up at 6 o'clock in the morning every day. They have thousands of employees. They're all fighting with each other to get this piece of land or that job or this. I knew a lot of them because when my dad was senator, and they are also all very, very smart. And the keyboard warriors that saying, you know, Trump.
So Trump came from that milieu.
Yeah, yes, he did. Yeah, that's one reason he's popular with the American people, because he was not a professional politician. He was a businessman who lived in the real world, you know. But back to your question about Trump and India.
China. First China, please.
Well, no, first I'd like to talk about India, because there's something I really want to say, and it's really important. It's dear to my heart. Guess who's captured the heart of the United States with her beauty, her charm, her grace? Usha Vance.
Okay.
I think it's wonderful. It's historic that our first time we have a second lady who's from India and is incredibly intelligent, absolutely beautiful, you know. When she smiles, I see Aishwarya Rai, you know, the beauty, that beauty that radiates from Indian women. And she's also very dignified. And she's got 3 small children, and a lot of leftists have been harassing her and her children. It's not easy being in politics. It's not easy on a family. I speak from experience, and I find it. And I always defend the children of any politician, of presidents, senators, Republican or Democratic. It didn't matter to me. I defended the Bush twins, George W. Bush's twins. People attacked them. I defended Chelsea Clinton when she was a young woman, the Clinton's daughter. Let's leave the family out of it. But and so I feel Mrs. Vance is going to make a big difference. We also have so many Indians in the cabinet. We've got Kash Patel. We have Dr. Jay Bhattacharya to run the National Institute of Health, which is fantastic. We have Tulsi Gabbard, who is about to make a trip to India, I believe.
So is, in fact, J.D. Vance, by the way.
Yes.
End of this month.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. Have you seen the pictures of him with they did Western shadi and they did a Deshi shadi. In the Deshi shadi, he's wearing a kurta, she's wearing a beautiful sari, lal sari, and all the jewelry, everything. And I think it's going to be very exciting. And also, President Trump, because he lived in the real world, not in the inside the Beltway, he knows that India is a very important country. He knows that it's the world's largest democracy. One thing my father said, did I already say this? I don't think I did. When he was leaving India, he gave a press conference, and I found all, again, this was pre-internet, but printed out, I found all the write-ups about it in the Indian press, and he said, I wish American senators and businessmen would take more interest in democratic India than communist China. But they all seem to want to rush to China. Well, COVID has changed that. And Xi Jinping's strong hand, a totalitarian fist, if you will, has been laid bare for the world to see, and people don't like it. Chinese people don't like it either. I mean, the Indian press, by the way, does a good job of getting what footage can be gotten out of communist China to show people pushing back. Even in Tibet, it's heartbreaking because there's no one coming to save them. But back to Trump and India, I know some people concerned about the tariffs, I think. But India, the other thing my father always said about India, and I would agree, is that India's a strong country and should be treated as such, and India can take care of itself. It doesn't need USAID. I think that's true.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Maura, of course, this has to be asked. Please. So you think that Xi Jinping is not going to get a free pass when it comes to Mr. Trump?
Well, he didn't in the first term of Trump. I will never forget the day, Joyeeta. It was July of 2018. I spent 6 months in Kathmandu, which I used to love so very much, where I worked and now is going through a very hard time with the collapse of the monarchy and the Maoist government that is not effective, not serving the Nepalese people. I walked into the Annapurna Hotel. It's a very famous hotel, and it had a famous newsstand with newspapers from all over Asia. The day Trump put tariffs on communist China. And I couldn't believe it. I felt the earth move under my feet. I spent 5 hours sitting in the Annapurna coffee shop reading through every single newspaper. And what I found very interesting is some of the strongest voices in favor of tariffs, because we've been saying this for years in the Tibet movement. The only thing that will ever, ever bring down the Chinese Communist Party is hit them in the pocketbook. Stop sending all of our jobs over there. And in his first term, President Trump brought a lot of manufacturing jobs back to the United States. I could see how Bill Clinton's trade deals destroyed New York State and all the Rust Belt states. It doesn't take long to destroy a society. Just get rid of all the jobs. Bring fentanyl in instead of a good job at a factory. And that's what you see in New York. So in any case, a lot of the strongest voices the pro-tariff were Chinese businessmen who had escaped from China, who were based in Bangkok or Singapore or the Philippines or somewhere in Asia, and saying, yes, yes, you must do this, Chairman Mao, starved my grandparents, tortured my mother, bring down the evil Chinese Communist Party and free the people of China. This is the argument that I have tried to make so many times to Western appeasers, the appeasement crowd, who say, oh, the Chinese Communist Party has done such a great job, and Chinese people need a strong hand. I said, really? I don't think so. Let them have a chance to be democratic. That's what the students died for in Tiananmen Square. So I think that the Xi Jinping is in for a rough ride with the tariffs. At that night, by the way, I met with a lot of my Tibetan friends in Kathmandu and said, oh my God, I can't believe it. This is finally happening. Finally, America is using the money card for the first time. So, if the tariffs have to be, also, again, some people were calling me, saying, oh, this is so terrible. Some USAID money is going to fund the Tibetan government in exile. Now it's gone. I said, so what? The Indian government doesn't need USAIDs poking around, especially when it comes to Tibet, which is a security issue. And the Indian government and the Indian people deserve a gold medal for their service not just to the Tibetan refugees, but India has the most diverse refugee communities in the world. Afghan refugees, Sri Lankan refugees, Burmese refugees. There's so many here. And that's India. I don't see anyone escaping to communist China asking for refuge. Do you? No.
So, Maura, I think this has been an extremely enlightening, happening, funny, but at the same time very serious conversation. We have to have another one before you leave. And by the way, viewers, she's very keen that in the future, in the near future, maybe even this year, she will come and settle permanently in India. She has been talking about it for the last, ever since I met her, I think in the last 10 days or something like that. So, thank you, Maura, for coming to this show. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Until the next time.
And thank you, Joyeeta, for doing such a wonderful job. I'm a huge fan of your work. And it was really an honor. And I just want to say, Bharat Mata ki jai.
Thank you, Maura.
Hamesha and forever. Dil hai Hindustani.
Yes, that's excellent. Thank you, viewers, for watching. Until the next time.